Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Jamf After Dark podcast, a podcast to introduce you to the excellent people of Jamf and keep you up to date with what is new and exciting with managing Apple devices. In today's episode, we're going to talk about malware, but not in a FUD kind of way, in what we're seeing in the real world kind of way, with Jaron Bradley, Jamf's manager of Malware Detections. And as always, I'm your co-host, Annie Halbert, and I'm joined today by Charles Edge. Say hi, Charles.
Hello, everyone. So when we have a new guest, we love to start the episodes with an origin story. So how did you end up at Jamf? And while we said your title, what is it that you actually do here?
Yeah, so I actually ended up at Jamf by getting acquired by Jamf. I'd been at a company called Digita Security, not for very long before Jamf actually acquired that small cybersecurity startup. And that brought us over here. So that brought me into the role of kind of a detections lead role, where my responsibility is kind of to take malware that's out there, to take attacker techniques that are out there, and to try and ensure that when they occur, we catch them.
Nice. And if I remember correctly, you actually wrote a book on that, right?
Yeah. So prior to, having come over here or anything, I'd written a book on Mac incident response, actually titled OS X incident response. My running joke there is, the book was already outdated a month after I released it because Apple decided to change the name of their operating system, like the month after I released a book with that in the title.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's computers.
Yep.
Just in general.
Absolutely.
Truly. And, since the introduction of the first virus in the wild called Elk Cloner for the Apple II, the Apple platform has been pretty solid with malware. But the words virus, Trojan, worm, zombie, persistent threat, logic bomb, they all sound messy. Do you mind taking us through how you like to define this malware spectrum?
Yeah, for sure. But first, I'm going to rewind there and talk about Elk Cloner, because you just, jumped right over that fun little prank without elaborating on it too much. But actually, not really talk much to Elk Cloner. But yeah, this is one of the early viruses, just kind of a worm that spread across stuff. And I'd debate that a lot of people that end up in security end up in it because they like playing pranks on people's computers. And I think that's ultimately how I got into it as well. Get on my brother's computers, leave some type of little say logic in the background that'll just make their computer start talking to him at a random time. Like, that's kind of how...
Ooh, eject their disk drive every 5 minutes.
Back when we had disk drives.
Classic.
Yeah, those were the dreams. So anyway, yeah, small little side note there. But virus, Trojan, worm, like these are all different types of malware, right? So a lot of your worm stuff, that's probably one of the earliest versions of malware that could kind of propagate across systems without really needing any user interaction. Trojans are more often than not used to kind of more for spying on people, and then viruses are usually more of a hacky type. I don't know. I guess I in my head, I generally associate those with more of a hacktivist style of almost pranks, right? Like when you want to play pranks on people, you don't hear a lot about viruses so much anymore. Usually the word Trojan or something like that is passed around because viruses were more so you'd know you had a virus, versus a Trojan is meant to be on a system to just kind of spy on users. So
I used to joke that the old RM-RF as a payload for malware just wouldn't spread very far, right?
You're not wrong. Yeah, it does seem like, I remember when I was learning about, viruses and stuff like that, when I was pretty young. And, I remember hearing about the Windows bug, I can't remember what it's called, that makes all of the text fall to the bottom of the screen. And I just remember thinking that would just be funny. But now it's a legitimate vector for bad actors to do bad stuff instead of just like a happy fun time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pranking each other's computers.
I think one of the classic pranks, I used to think this was hilarious as a kid, this was on Windows. There was some type of virus out there that you could run to get it to happen. But basically, like, if a user was moving their mouse around and they hover over an icon, that icon would jump to the other side of the screen. Right, like, so they're trying to click this icon and like chase it around the screen. I don't know. That's why we do what we do,
I remember that. That was back in the era when you could send self-contained executables without any DLLs or anything, and there was no signing requirement, so they'd just open right up on machines. And you could even put them in like the path to them in an autoexec bat or as a special name on the root level of a floppy, and every time you inserted the floppy, it would auto run that. It was good times.
And then,
that was great prankage.
And then somebody finds out about it, over at Windows or wherever, and ruins all the fun.
Right. And that's
man. I can't even play a Steam game like from my library of 800 Steam games without accepting like 10 system preferences things now. It's like, oh, do you want to be able to use your keyboard on this game? You do? Please select this checkbox. Like,
Yep.
But that keeps us safe.
It does keep us safe. Yeah. As safe as we can be, I guess. That's an interesting point with security. A lot of these things were features, and then they became weaponized. And so there's this difference between like an attack vector and the actual weaponization of it. And so something that wasn't in the show notes before, but there's news that came out this week. So speaking of that kind of differentiation, Patrick Wardle posted a flaw with macOS, I guess you'd call it. And the team at Jamf posted a sample, not a sample, I guess, but a report about finding a sample that weaponized that in the wild, right?
Yeah, definitely. So ultimately, Patrick kind of revealed that there was this new bug out there, or vulnerability out there, that allowed software, or scripts in this case, to bypass just the initial checks that Apple generally performs the first time software is run, the initial security checks that software performs. So we were able to kind of take that behavior that we then heard about and do some setup for trying to ensure if one of those behaviors ever happened, we would see it. And sure enough, it didn't take long before we found malware that actually was, using this technique already, despite the fact this technique wasn't previously known that it was possible.
So it was still pretty much an O-Day, but it was actually out there being weaponized.
Yeah, definitely. It was a 0-day bypass that the developers of the Schleyer malware had discovered and implemented into their install process.
Wouldn't it be so much more helpful if these malware developers disclosed the flaw in the first place? But I suppose that's not going to happen.
No. Sometimes you hope with, Apple kind of opening a new bug bounty program and all that. Maybe some people would rather test their luck that way instead of abusing it. But Schleyer is a very, it's everywhere out there on the internet. So, and it's kind of ad-based in a sense. What it ultimately ends up dropping is adware. So I don't have any idea what kind of money adware developers make, but given how widespread the malware is, I would think they're doing okay.
Well, to spend all day in this sort of space, it sounds like one of the coolest jobs in IT. I've talked with some, red and blue team friends of mine, and from my software engineer brain, it's a totally different mindset to be hunting these things down. And it's a bit like a puzzle. So we have people on staff who spend all day finding, inspecting, reverse engineering what these things do.
Yeah.
Sounds like a dream.
Yeah. No, it's a fun time. It definitely is. To be kind of on the threat hunting side it's definitely a field that, is hurting for people and needs more people. There's a lot, I would argue there's a lot more bad guys than there are good still, but it's definitely fun to kind of get your hands on something, do some reverse engineering, find ways to detect it. And then, one of the big challenges in these types of roles is trying to just stay ahead of the attackers, right? How do you set up detections that will trigger in scenarios like this, where there's a vulnerability out there that nobody really knows exists? How do you get generic enough to detect attacker activity while still not filling up with useless detections that are false positives? You got to try and find that balance when you're writing a good detect. False positives versus reliability, I guess.
Yeah, and I would say that goes into the investment thesis around why Jamf acquired Digita in the first place. This threat hunting, as opposed to just the traditional signature-based or even heuristic-based detection of malware. Given the experience the founders had, it really made sense to take all that data about persistent threats and what's running on the device and treat everything with zero trust and inspect what it was doing after the fact and then analyze it locally. I think when it comes to something like finding Schleyer in the wild, that's a great example of we have this detection system, we find this exploit or this potential exploit, and then we can use that detection system across all those devices to try to see if there's actually samples in the wild, right?
Yep, that's right. So we kind of have, at Jamf Protect, we kind of have two different styles of detections that we generally do. One is like the behavioral side, right? We're analyzing, like you mentioned, we're able to analyze how certain programs are behaving on the system when they run. And then we have a whole other side of the product that's kind of your more typical like threat prevention antivirus approach that looks for actual signatures, just what the files look like compared to what malware we've known in the past looks like. So we kind of have those two different approaches that we manage on my team.
It's important to do both, but the behavioral is really, to me at least, the most valuable aspect, because those O days that haven't been discovered yet, that's, to me, the more dangerous thing. Any CLAM AV type of implementation can just look at those signatures, right?
Yep,
so.
Absolutely. And I agree with the behaviors are, how you stay ahead of the game, basically. Threat signatures and the CLAM AV stuff you're referring to is how you make sure, like, if somebody else gets hit with something, you can check to see if you got hit with it too. But the behaviors are how you try and stay ahead of the attackers. And when different techniques are used, you catch those techniques rather than the exact tooling that attackers tend to use.
Thinking through Schleyer or any other crafty thing that's recently came up, you mentioned that what that's doing is delivering kind of an adware system. So changing your default homepage on the browser, what exactly is it doing?
Yeah, so Schleyer itself is actually just a dropper. The dropper basically runs in a very crafty way and ultimately ends up dropping some form of adware. That adware is different in various scenarios of what version of Schleyer was downloaded. So it's not installing one specific piece of adware. It kind of bundles itself with a bunch of different adwares. Schleyer itself is just the dropper that gets the adware onto the system. So in the sample that we kind of analyzed, it actually did do this in a very stealthy, kind of crafty way. And it's been known to be doing this for a while, but it basically takes a bash script that would bypass the security features that we talked about. That bash script is maybe all of something like 7 or 8 lines. But then at the bottom of that bash script is a zip file, basically just pasted right into the raw contents of the script. So the Schleyer dropper does is it will look at itself, it will look at the contents of its own file, it will pull that zip file out of itself basically and then unzip it, which ultimately ends up running some type of executable payload. So it's kind of like a bash script that's holding a whole nother payload at the bottom of that bash script.
I love how crafty that is. I mean, it's not
so basic.
Yeah, it's not curling down some zip file,
right.
So it doesn't get trapped in that whole downloads mechanism.
Older versions did. This was kind of after reports come out, you see that your adware is getting caught, and this is one of the things developers of Schleyer have done well is when they know they get caught, they kind of adapt. And sometimes they don't adapt. And I would imagine that just comes to the level of success that they're having. I'm sure they have a way of viewing that, how often they're getting installed and things like that. But it seems like when they get slowed down, they find a new way to adapt. And this was one of those ways.
Do you have any idea since you mentioned the developers of Schleyer, what kind of telemetry do we have into where this is coming from?
Yeah, I myself don't have any info there. I know some speculation has been made in the past by some other security companies, but I try not to talk to speculation, so I'm unsure there.
Fair. Yeah. I mean, it does seem ultimately like at some point there's a ACH transfer to get a hold of funds or some kind of paper trail.
Yeah. You think so?
It's all in Bitcoin.
That's right. Ad-based Bitcoin. It's next level.
So just a process question, because I'm curious about all this. Where do you find a sample of malware? Does someone like it's not on GitHub, obviously. You can't just
you might be surprised.
Fork the... Oh, no. Well, I'd hope not, but when someone discloses a 0-day thing like Patrick did, where did he get the code? Hopefully he wasn't just digging around, in his downloads folder and being like, oh, there's some malware.
I mean, knowing Patrick, you never know with that guy. But
Patrick also doesn't have a really bad Minnesota accent, so sorry, Patrick.
Essentially, you're talking a couple of different ways, right? Either we enable that, we kind of take a detection and enable it, and we come across it somewhere in the wild where it triggers, we take a closer look and we decide, oh, hey, this is very bad. Let's get our hands on this and start ripping it apart. Or alternatively, depending on kind of your way of going about detecting things, like maybe you can also come across it on, say, VirusTotal. If you have an account there and you're able to kind of look around at all the different samples and executables that are sitting on there, maybe you're also able to discover it through that service or another, similar service like VirusTotal.
So part of the answer is it's either hosted somewhere or you have to trawl through the parts of the internet that we're told not to go to. Don't click on the stuff if it looks sketchy on purpose.
Yep. That's definitely another way to come across it.
Sounds scary.
When it comes to Schlayer, it's actually not hard to find. You can come across it, as we kind of talked about in our blog post. A lot of users are being brought to it via poisoned Google result, or any search engine results. It doesn't have to be Google, but poisoned search results where attackers kind of compromise websites, and if a user visits that website from like a search engine result, they're redirected and brought to some brand new website that's hosting the malware. That, along with pirated software, that's like a guaranteed place to pick up some type of Schlayer variant. Very common among pirated software, pirated movies, etc.
Once we have that sample in our grubby little hands, are we disassembling and decompiling? I mean, you mentioned that this one is a bash wrapper that's got a zip file inside of it, effectively, but I would assume most aren't just little shell or Python script types of paxies, but they're much more. And a lot of times we have to disassemble or inspect much more deeply. So what is the process like for that?
Yeah. And I mean, for starters, on what you spoke to there briefly, we do end up with a surprising amount of bash script malware, Python-based malware, scripting malware in general. It's still alive and well. And I think one of those reasons is it's very easy to adjust script-based malware, right? So we see a lot of developer projects or red team projects that are written in Python or other languages. So it is actually not all just about, compiled executables, but we still are dealing with a lot of script-based malware these days. But when it's not script-based, obviously it's great when it's script-based because we can just read that plain text. But yeah, when it's not, there's a whole slew of things we do to try and get more details about what's happening with this executable. A lot of times that's just throwing it inside a controlled environment and executing it, right? And watching what it does, installing a number of different kind of monitoring software to see what it's doing, what files is it manipulating, what files is it dropping, what processes does it create, what recon commands does it run. Malware often performs these types of lookups and actions. So we'll do that. And then, like you mentioned, decompilers and reverse engineering. One of my favorite tools is a Hopper decompiler. You can use it for debugging also, for just kind of putting little breakpoints on the malware and just stopping it when you want and seeing how it's behaving in different areas. It's definitely, it's like a giant puzzle.
Yeah, before Hopper, I feel like I was using just strings commands and things like that,
Yep. And strings is a great way. Fine, that's almost always the default command, right? You get something back, someone's like, this is interesting, can you take a look? You run strings and you're like, sometimes you don't even need to decompile, right? You're just like, oh yeah, this is bad. You see a domain in there. Yeah,
I've won at least a couple points in capture the flag competitions just from using strings. It's all faithful.
Yep. You find yourself a domain, you find yourself a password sitting in there. Sometimes those are, once again, the good old days where you just run strings and find everything plain text inside the executable. A lot of attackers now use some different obfuscating techniques that make that a lot more complex than it used to be. But Sometimes you get lucky.
In the investigation process, has there ever been, you said potentially there's a domain hiding in the malware. Is there some IP address or a host name out there that can actually be like shut down remotely? Can it be used as an attack vector back towards them?
So can it be shut down remotely? I mean, not like by anybody that just feels like shutting it down per se.
Unless you want to DDoS
Yeah, I
them.
wasn't going to say that.
That's what I was
wasn't
gonna
gonna
say.
say that, but yeah, unless you want to,
Two wrongs don't make a
take
right.
justice into your own hands, and yeah.
Are you really saying it's unethical to DDoS a hacker?
I mean, these are the questions.
That's true.
But, like an ISP or a provider of some type, I would think has that power. I don't know a ton about it from that side. A lot of the craftier malware, kind of like when its cover is blown, it won't want to leave that type of server running, and it usually comes down shortly after if there's a giant blog post on it or something like that. But yeah.
Makes sense.
Yep.
So what percentage of the samples that we come across are traditional Trojans and worms or signature, where there's signatures out there? And what percentage are really more persistent threats, like what nation states were using against one another to blow up, I don't know, centrifuges a decade or a week ago?
So percentage-wise, I don't know those exact numbers. I will say that on Mac specifically, we definitely still see a lot of adware. It seems to rule the malware world so long as you're including adware inside the malware world. So we definitely see a lot of adware. When it comes to kind of the more espionage side of things that you're referring to, we still see that. It still comes around. It definitely does not come around as often, or at least you don't see it blogged about quite as often. It's still definitely a very real threat on Mac. I've seen intrusions happen in Mac environments just like I've seen them happen on Windows environments where a user or an attacker, manages to convince one user to run their malware, and then all of a sudden that attacker is somehow moving across the entire environment over SSH credentials or whatever it be. It happens just the same way, and I would say it's definitely more rare than Windows, but I think kind of as the market continues to shift, I think we'll very likely see more and more of that happening on Mac.
Yeah, and once you get that rat or some kind of rootkit or whatever the cool new name is for such things on a device, the ability to move laterally becomes so dangerous because so many networks are still that traditional crunchy on the outside, soft and gooey on the inside, I guess. Mm-hmm. Even if a lot of the devices aren't necessarily, but it's like, oh, there's a open telnet port on the UPS that runs the rack of servers. Mm-hmm. There's so many different ways to do all these things. It's pretty wild according to what it is that you're trying to gain access to and why. And the more targeted, the harder it is to protect, I guess. So
yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that, like I said, the attackers that are kind of capable of that type of thing, they're knowledgeable about the Mac environment, just like attackers who are attacking Windows are very knowledgeable about the internals of the Windows environment. So they're definitely out there. I would for sure argue it happens less, but it's not to say it never happens for sure.
So the research done on macOS security, it's not done in a complete vacuum. Like the people that do this for Apple, even though you're somewhat competitors, you can share and build upon that research as it's being published, right?
I would like to think those that are researching on the macOS platform are pretty open to sharing this type of knowledge. So, I mean, I guess a good example of that is, once again, Patrick's Objective by the Sea conference is generally a conference that's dedicated to just different Apple device research that's been done by individuals and the different findings that everyone has come across. So yeah, everybody is kind of off doing their own thing, but when some type of breakthrough is kind of found and needs to be shared, I don't know, everybody's generally pretty excited about nerding out and sharing that with each other, I would say.
It's the common ground.
Yeah. Yes, very much. I have loved, whether it's the team at Malwarebytes or any of the other companies that we kind of come across, getting to see that collaboration in an extremely non-competitive way. It's almost academic. It's fun to see people geek out because ultimately there's something new and super crafty and everybody's like, ooh, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
And we're all out there to protect people,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's sometimes with security, with security guys, there can be a mindset like just that, well, there isn't anything left to learn. I've mastered it. Like that's never true. And that's never the case. Like nobody in security or almost any type of computer work should ever have that mindset. There's just always something different to learn and always someone different to learn it from. So
technology is all about the evolutions that lead to the next innovation, right?
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about malware and want to bring it back to broadening the perspective on security for a minute. We've been asking folks to offer their holy grail of advice to an Apple admin with a bunch of devices. So if you could give that one piece of advice to that Apple admin, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I'll kind of stick to 2 bullet points here. I think
we asked for one. That's not allowed.
Man. All right. Well, then in
just kidding.
First
I love 2.
I'm going to give
great.
2, but if I had to give only 1, I mean, just a big check mark there. And this is going to sound like probably a total cliche, but training your users is just such an important part. What suspicious activity looks like, who should be reaching out and asking for your password, the answer is nobody. And what does kind of a suspicious website look like? Train your users to recognize what these suspicious scenarios look like. A lot of attacks are just still done through convincing social engineering. Go download the latest Flash player. You got to install it if you want to watch this video. Flash player's not even around anymore. like it's getting users kind of up to date just with some of this training is still very important. My second, if I had a second, it would be for IT admins just to be aware of their internal environments. Watch those SSH servers that are build servers or whatever it be. Like, just make sure you know what normal activity looks like, so when something strange does happen, you know that you need to look into it, and you know what that suspicious activity does look like. So those are my 2 bullet points.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. Set up some nice CloudWatch alarms. You're golden.
Did they say that? I don't think I've heard that.
I think I read it somewhere.
I liked it.
Wait, we're talking about Reddit now? Wait.
Yes. We've moved.
No. Well, Jaron, thank you so much for hanging out with us today and discussing malware, discussing kind of how your approach with Digita has integrated into Jamf. Super interesting to hear about what you're working on, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today and tuning into the Jamf After Dark podcast. Send us fan mail at podcast@jamf.com. Be good to each other, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.